Welcome to the Sherry Sylvester Show. It has been 7 months since the Hamas attack on Israel, a horrific attack of wanton killing, rape, and torture, which the terrorists gleefully filmed so they could show it to the world. The worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Shortly afterwards, two of my colleagues at TPPF, Chuck DeVore and Erin Valdez, who are with me here today, gathered with Rabbi Dan Ain for what we call around here a live stream primer. Back then, we wanted to discuss the dangerous links between wokeness on campuses fueled by diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and the reflexive support for Hamas terrorists that was immediately demonstrated after the attack. What we saw clearly was laid open to the world when we saw the Ivy League college presidents who could not bring themselves to condemn anti-Semitism and pro-Hamas protests, while world opinion escalated against Israel, following Hamas communications plan. We've seen this play out at the University of Texas just up the street and other public university campuses across the state. And as we tape this podcast, we are dealing with President Joe Biden's announcement last week that he will be withholding military aid for Israel. I invited Chuck and Erin to join me today to reflect on what we said 6 months ago and talk about what we've seen play out. Chuck DeVore is the Chief National Initiatives Officer here at TPPF. He guides the Foundation's national work in border security, election integrity, energy, and conservative criminal justice reform. He's authored 3 books, most recently, The Crisis of the House Never United, a novel of early America. Chuck is a retired U.S. Army colonel who regularly appears on Fox News and is a senior contributor at the Federalist. Erin Valdez is the Higher Education Policy Director for TPPF's Next Generation Texas campaign. She taught for over a decade in Austin area schools and served as an assistant principal at a charter school in Louisville. Erin is an expert on a dozen issues in higher education, from accreditation to civic leadership and outcomes-based metrics, and frequently appears on higher education panels all over the country. She holds an MA in Classics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a BA in Classical Studies from Hillsdale College. Welcome, colleagues. I wanted to ask you, when we gathered in November, less than a month after the attack, one of the things that we were discussing or trying to explain to people was the role that Iran played in the attack and how Hamas was a proxy of Iran and there were other proxies. And then, just last week on campus, we found this.
Meanwhile, Dana, you've got Hamas propaganda now showing up on college campuses, suggesting some protesters are not merely supporting the Palestinian cause, but rather backing the terror group's message of armed struggle against Israel. William Lajeunesse is following that. He's got the story live from Los Angeles. William, what you find out?
Well, Bill, school officials found these documents after police broke up an encampment at the University of Texas in April. Now, the materials, experts say, are a recruiting tool using students' sympathy for the Palestinians to introduce more extreme views. So the handouts that you're about to see are held together by clips, rubber bands, and binders. They celebrate the death of innocent Jews and elimination of Israel. In Glory to Gaza, one document says, armed struggles enshrined in law. In that struggle for liberation, they celebrate rocket attacks on Zionist settlements, with over 2,300 rockets launched last year. They also reject peace or a two-state solution, saying, we are not satisfied with coexistence or ending apartheid. We must liberate the land from the river to the sea. Another quotes the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. That's a known terrorist group that targets Israeli civilians, quoting, we will emerge upon you from where you least expect it.
It repetitively calls for the absolute elimination of Israel and Israelis through violence, and that's about as extreme as it gets.
Some materials source the Resistance News Network, a radical anti-Semitic English-language Telegram channel that promotes Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Officials also found weapons, chains, and steel cables to barricade doors, and buckets of rocks and bricks to assault police.
From the Hamas perspective, I'm sure that they want to normalize themselves. They want to make themselves look reasonable, and that they're a good organization.
So at UC San Diego, police also found wooden stakes, metal and plywood shields, spray cans, and a sword. About 35% of those arrested at UCSD were not students, half at Texas.
Well, imagine
Bill?
that. Thank you.
So right up the street,
Yeah.
less than half a mile. What do you think, Chuck? Why don't you start?
Well, I mean, certainly you've seen Iran's hand in this, not only with the support of weaponry and of money going to not only Hamas, but Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and other organizations, but also, of course, the nation of Qatar, who has been funding generously universities all over the country, especially elite institutions, which may be causing some degree of hesitation among the leadership to crack down or to say things that would be contrary to the interests of these major funders. So we certainly know from the money standpoint. And one of the interesting things for me was that under the administration of Trump, you saw a significant effort it was called the Maximum Pressure Campaign, to put sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran and starve them of money. And during that period of time when the Maximum Pressure Campaign was working, Iran didn't have the money for these things, and their proxies were also not particularly well funded, not particularly able to cause much trouble. But now they're flush with cash. Biden has sent them billions and billions of dollars, some of which I'm sure have ended right back on our campuses.
Yeah. So, Erin, you've been watching this up there. The students and the faculty have been very outraged. They've come back and said that attempts to shut this down is depriving them of their free speech. So we're big on free speech here at TPPF. What do you think of their argument?
You know, I'd love to hear them make that argument if the protesters had been on a different side of the issue. I doubt that they would have been such free speech absolutists, and that's really the problem here, is that I don't believe that anybody, at least that we're standing with, is cracking down or urging a crackdown on free speech. We're actually arguing for equal application of policies. University of Texas does have policies on time, place, and manner, and they enforce them even-handedly this time around. And it just so happened that the folks that were in violation of those rules were, I'd say, pro-Palestinian, possibly pro-Hamas protesters. And that's when you start to hear about free speech. You don't hear about it when there are conservative groups or groups on the right protesting.
Why do you say possibly pro-Hamas?
Well, I think what we just saw, is an indication that it's more than just support for Palestinians. Hatred of Zionism goes beyond simply hatred of the Jewish state. What we see is it tips over very obviously in many cases into anti-Semitism. And so these folks are not here because they believe there should be a two-state solution or that there should be peaceful coexistence. That's not what they're after. And most of the students, unfortunately, who are out here, if they can't articulate anything, it would be something like from the river to the sea. And of course, that is an argument for the destruction of the state of Israel.
Yeah. And Senator Betancourt, one of our favorite senators around here, says they don't know which river or which sea.
Right.
That's correct.
Yeah, needed to spend a little more time in world history or geography.
So how did this happen? When we were looking at it in November, one of the things that the attack on Israel was October 7. These people were in the streets October 8. The action was almost reflexive. And we looked at it and we thought it was reflexive. What we're learning now from the, quote, outside agitators, and I have a little problem with that term, but what we're learning is that there have been professionals on campus for months.
Yeah, this is a problem that goes back quite a long ways. So, for example, during the Los Angeles riots in 1992, where I served at the time as a captain and led foot patrols through kind of the heart of the destruction, we were picking up flyers even then that were from, for example, the World Socialist Workers Organization or different entities that were calling for revolution. They were calling for civil war. They were calling for people to attack the police. And so here you have a group that had flyers on the ground. Remember, this is in the day and age when you had to use faxes, right? Or maybe email if you were lucky. They had flyers on the ground very quickly calling for a broader revolution. So these are the same sorts of groups that have been embedded in the country for a long time. They received funding directly from the now defunct Soviet Union. Now they're getting funding from the People's Republic of China. They're getting funding from Qatar. They're getting funding even from the Palestinian groups. There was a report I just saw in the last few days where some universities had even been receiving up to $1 million from Hamas, presumably of money that American taxpayers had initially given to help Palestinian, to help the people with relief, right? And so that money is actually coming back here, fomenting unrest on our campuses. So this is by far and away not spontaneous. These students would be doing other things, probably studying, if they weren't trying to fill up buckets full of rocks and bricks to throw at the police, as we found on the UT campus.
Well, and that's one of the things that we know now that we didn't know. We thought it was reflexive at the outset.
Wall Street Journal just came out with a report on this, and it basically they found what shouldn't be surprising, which is that at Columbia, student leaders had been coordinating with groups for months in advance of these marches and protests. Groups that included the National Students for Justice in Palestine, right? So one of the student leaders, as a graduate student leader, said, "We took notes from our elders, engaged in dialogue with them, and analyzed how the university responded to previous protests." So to your point, Chuck, they're watching, they're learning from history, they're learning the weaknesses in the psychology of the leaders of these administrations, and they're only going to come back stronger. And that's the other takeaway from the reporting that's been done on this is not the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning. We're going to see more of this summer going into the conventions. They're just getting warmed up.
Well, one of the things, we as conservatives say a lot, the legacy media doesn't matter. But it looked to me like from the beginning that this was a communications strategy, that Hamas didn't care how many people that they killed. They were willing to give that up. And almost immediately, once the body count started to rise in Gaza, and you see that now even when people like, let's say, Politico are trying to be balanced, they'll say over 1,700 people were killed in Israel, 35,000 have been killed, Palestinians. Now, we don't know, of course, how many Palestinians have been killed, because they're giving us bad numbers. But it does seem to me that, at least in terms of world opinion, they've been really successful. And Ilhan Omar said that these protests are the reason that Biden has backed down on sending the bombs over.
Well, that and the fact that he's desperate to shore up his left-wing base within the Democratic Party, right? Increasingly since the unrest of the Vietnam War in the latter part of the 60s, the Democratic Party has shifted pretty far to the left, especially on foreign policy. You saw a brief break during the Clinton administration, but more or less, that's the direction that the party has gone. And so they're very concerned that if he continues to show overt support for Israel, that he's going to lose his base, and presumably those people will stay home or maybe vote for Kennedy Jr., right? So I think there's a lot of political considerations going into this. And insofar as the information war, Hamas, of course, has been very adept at playing to a sympathetic audience. They, of course, control all of the information about the supposed casualty count coming out of the Gaza Strip. When you look at how many fighters they had and how any time, for example, if there's an 18-year-old fighter that may be killed even while they're welding a weapon, they'll call that as a child being killed by the Israel Defense Forces. So you can't put any trust at all within the numbers. But even so, they're the ones that launch this war. And so you can't launch a war and then go hide behind your civilians and somehow expect maximal restraint from your enemy while they try to eliminate the threat. So they are purposefully using their own people as shields, people, by the way, which overwhelmingly voted for Hamas in the last free election that they had in Gaza. What is it now, going on 12 plus years ago? I'm trying to remember when exactly that election was. You hold it once, though, and you're done in that part of the world.
Well, and the analogy that I hear, and tell me if it holds, Chuck, because you're the military guy, we only so many, a couple of thousand people were killed at Pearl Harbor. We ended up killing many, many more Japanese, and it was never the goal of the U.S. to kill the Japanese people.
No, it was the goal in warfare is to break the will of the enemy to resist, right? And so the problem is with modern warfare and modern communications, typically breaking the will of the enemy to resist is very ugly, and modern democracies don't do a good job doing it anymore. It often, in the past, has involved blockades or sieges of cities and starving people out, or destroying large swaths of urban areas of your enemy, as we did to Germany and Japan in World War II, or utterly destroying their army and thus their will to resist. And so what you're finding now, though, in modern conflict is that for most Western nations, the cost of imposing your will on the enemy far exceeds the appetite to do it.
Erin, you spend a lot of time on campus. We know that 657 faculty members signed a letter calling for saying they had no confidence in the UT President Jay Hartzell after he called in the state police, and another 800 graduate faculty said that he should step down. If you're on, and that's roughly a third. That's roughly a third. There's 3,000 people in the faculty. I heard over the weekend that there have been 2,300 students arrested nationwide. There's 15.2 million kids in college. So is this just on the periphery if you're on campus and it's just that's where the news media is pointing the cameras?
It's a good question. I think that most students over the past couple of weeks have been preoccupied with finals. If you really want to know what's going on campus, that's what most students are focused on. It is typically a fringe operation, but it's a fringe that can grow in strength, and this is why we're concerned about what happens on campuses, because it doesn't stay on campus. About 15 years ago, there was a lot of talk about these sort of eruptions of anti-liberal, anti-free speech kinds of movements, microaggressions. And, some people were worried about it. And other people said, well, when these kids graduate, they'll leave it behind. The real world will beat it out of them. And, well, look who was right. The real world conformed to the graduates that left because they take leadership positions in key institutions. And so that's why we care about what's happening on campus, because even if it is a fringe, it's an influential fringe. It does move presidential action as we've seen. And so that's why we should care about it, even if it's a small fraction of those on campus, because they typically have an outsized role to play in the leadership of key institutions.
Well, how did they, I know that you focus on classic education. How did they lose the thread on what actually happened in Israel? There's quite a record there. Even if you discount the Bible, there's quite a record there of what happened in 1947.
Yeah.
And
I think the answer there is that, well, it's not convenient to remember. We always say, don't forget. It's not convenient to their narrative to keep bringing up the story of what happened in World War II to the Jewish people, and that's simply because they're viewed as not an oppressed class. You can't have an oppressed oppressor-oppressed narrative where the oppressors were dramatically oppressed. And so I think that's what accounts for it. It's not the facts that matter. It is the narrative that matters, and that's the postmodern sort of influence that took place in the 60s and then again took root, and then we're seeing the fruit of that, which is facts don't matter. The only thing that matters is the narrative.
And so that's where we come back to DEI.
Right.
And the kind of the Marxist basis of DEI. I think what we talk about anti-Semitism, and you hear people arguing, well, it isn't anti-Semitic to say the river to the sea. These are the same people that tell us we can't use the word blackmail or redline.
Or master bedroom.
Or master bedroom. Right. So we kind of come back to that. But I think that what the problem is, that, or some people say that the problem is, I don't know if I agree with that, that some Jews have been very successful. They certainly play large roles in every aspect of our culture. A lot of them, as Rabbi Ain told us when he was here, were in Ivy League colleges. That was the goal, and so that makes them the enemy. It just switches. Forget the gas chambers. Forget Auschwitz. That was like nothing in its ancient history.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And if you kind of look at the role that DEI has played, it laid all the groundwork. It laid the sort of intellectual tracks for this to happen. So it shouldn't be surprising that we see Hamas come in with propaganda that fits perfectly into that narrative groove, right? I mean, if you believe that the Jewish people are oppressors, all you have to do is say, well, all you have to do is oppose them, and you're on the right side of history. Come join us, join the revolution, join the opposition. We're the true oppressed class here, and so it shouldn't be surprising at all that we see them taking advantage of this to the maximum extent possible. It's just a shame that I blame leadership on campus when there are these kinds of eruptions, that they haven't been more forceful about denouncing it and then taking care of it. And you can see the difference between what happened in some of the universities up in the Northeast and other places versus what's happened in the South, and specifically in Florida and Texas. And the difference there is that the university leadership never lost sight of what the university is there for.
I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but I want to ask Chuck one more military question. So how do we have Blinken and Austin and our strategic leaders arguing in support of really throttling Israel and not letting them move forward on this war? And I heard yesterday Congressman Adam Smith, is he from California? I don't know where he's from. Congressman Adam Smith actually said that Israel had provoked the October 7th attack. So that's how far they've gone.
Wow. Are you thinking of Schiff?
Is it a shift?
No, Adam Schiff. Is that who you're thinking of?
No, this was Adam Smith.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with that.
I remember because
interesting 435th member of Congress. Sorry about that. No, look, again, this is all political considerations. This all comes back to trying to salvage the Democrats' 2024 presidential election. And the only way they do that is by allowing Hamas to survive, to fight again another day, by somehow projecting the impression that America is holding Israel back. I don't think that's going to work. I think they're going to go ahead and do what they need to do. And you see that with their unfolding tactics, where they're trying to draw the Hamas fighters out into open fighting so that they can gradually eliminate them. It's going to be very difficult, though, because there is a lot of support for Hamas that remains in Gaza. And so it's difficult as they go in and they destroy the tunnel networks. By the way, all those tunnels built with humanitarian aid and aid that was, dollars that were converted into construction materials. And the left, by the way, was constantly complaining about, why is Israel preventing cement from coming into Gaza? Every city needs cement and rebar. Well, now you know why, because Hamas diverted hundreds of millions of dollars worth of humanitarian aid to build the world's most extensive underground military bunker complex in history. And it's gradually being destroyed right now.
You talk about the politics of it, and I've been thinking about it a lot, that I saw Mark Penn, and I read a survey that Mark Penn did. He's a Democrat pollster. And he says, if you ask the question straight up, support for Israel in this country is about 80-20, that it hasn't really changed. And he shows that across age demographics. You've got obviously a piece of the Democratic Party, but there's not a lot of Muslims in this country that are making that difference. But in Texas, the polling, and I listened to Joshua Blank and the UT Texas poll on this, and they showed that Texas was divided. And the reason they showed the division, and Mark Penn's talked about this, is because they asked people if you want peace in the Middle East. And if you've got that choice, well, that is, I think, what the Bible talks about, the peace passing understanding. I mean, yeah, everybody wants peace, but given given the choice, Americans are still firmly behind. And Penn has been counseling the Democrats, in his surveys and in his talking to media, going, forget this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they seem to be bent on their own destruction in terms of what advice they're taking, and sometimes it's easier to take advice from people that you sort of in your heart agree with anyway. And so I think that's telling that a lot of the leadership on the other side, they sometimes hear what they want to hear, and so I think that's something we can't underestimate.
Well, and likely voters are older and
Right.
they remember kind of the legacy of this.
Yeah.
You talked about what happened at the University of Texas, which has been ranked as the best response to these protests. Let's look at that and kind of remind ourselves. This is Kevin Eltife, who is the chair of the University of Texas System Board of Regents.
People taking part in the pro-Palestine protests we've seen on campus in Austin have called on UT to cut financial ties with Israel. Today, the head of UT's Board of Regents said that's not happening.
And as far as the calls to divestment is not an option. We will continue to maximize our investments to ensure our students have scholarships and we can provide an affordable, accessible education.
During today's Board of Regents meeting, UT System Chairman Kevin Eltife also continued to defend the university's decision to call in Texas DPS to respond to campus protests and invited DPS Director Stephen McCraw to the meeting today to thank him and the department publicly. Eltife also said UT will continue to call on DPS to help with protest response in the future if necessary.
So what does that say, other than we're all glad we live in Texas?
Well, I'll tell you, that riot gear brought back some memories for me. I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember wearing those things. I thought it was a great response, and I thought that that's obviously how it should be done. You shut these things down before they start. Speaking your mind is one thing. Illegally trespassing and occupying portions of a campus are completely different. So is intimidating your fellow students or harassing or threatening them. Those sorts of things aren't merely hate speech, which, by the way, there ought not be limitations on hate speech. Speech is speech. But when you talk to someone and threaten them, that's not speech, that's a threat.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to learn from this response. I mean, it comes back to what this student leader was saying, was that they watch the response of leadership on campus. These groups do. And it tells them where they can push, where the weak points are. I think Texas showed them there aren't that many weak points here. And the response before the occupation happened on campus was clear, heard loud and clear from President Hartzell. Here's what we're going to stand for, here's what we're not going to stand for, and you've been put on notice. And the same thing happened in Florida. So these groups knew what was going to happen. They thought they could call the bluff, and they were wrong. And so I think leadership matters. I only hope that going forward, leadership at universities takes a lesson of their own from this, which is to say it's okay to stand up to the mob, even if that mob is your faculty, on a number of issues and not just this one.
It's interesting. It's almost as if this happened in a vacuum. MIT, Columbia, Harvard, they're still saying they can't break up the encampments, as if
right.
And they're all near big cities.
Mm-hmm.
They could get
Mm-hmm.
police. I also read in the documents that the Hamas prep documents that they knew they could overcome campus police. That wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't anything that was worrying them.
Mm-hmm.
The divestiture was an interesting thing, too. There was a list at UT of who they want, Raytheon and Boeing and other people that they wanted to divest from. But if you've been to Israel, I mean, every American company's in Israel.
Well, and the thing that's important about Raytheon and Boeing and some of the others is that those are the firms that are a big part of Israel's layered anti-missile defense system. And so if it wasn't for those American contractors that are helping that system be the best anti-missile system in the world, and certainly something America should emulate, especially after President George W. Bush wisely removed us from the 1972 ABM treaty, the fact is that Israel did not have to immediately and devastatingly retaliate against the Islamic Republic of Iran precisely because the some 300 plus missiles that they launched at Israel were almost entirely ineffective because of the anti-missile shield that is made possible by companies like Boeing and Raytheon. So in fact, that missile defense shield actually prevented a wider war that could have engulfed the region and might have gone nuclear.
And just something on that point too, we talk a lot. There was recent news about the ESG, talk with the State Board of Education and putting our foot down and saying we're not going to go this direction in terms of the pension investments that we have in Texas. And this is the flip side of that. And the flip side of that is the fiduciary duty that the university has, that the state has, is to maximize the return on those investments, period. And it just so happens that free nations are better at capitalism than unfree nations are. And so as a result, of course, we should keep our investments in Israel because that only redounds to the benefit of Texas and the rest of the free world.
And we may have to make that argument next year, Erin, because we have anti-BDS laws in Texas for all state agencies, but the university systems have been carved out of that, so we may have to carve them back in. One of the other demands, and this got conflated on the campus, was that the faculty, these 657 faculty members, were very annoyed about the firing of the DEI officers, and they wanted those people retained, rehired, whatever. So that's been part of the debate, which to me proves our point.
Right.
The bringing it all in.
Well, it's telling that there was another protest planned on one of these days, and that protest was specifically around the firing of the DEI, staffers. And interestingly enough, that protest was, it was quietly folded into the pro-Palestine protests. What does that tell you? That's the solidarity point, right? In other words, the people that were out there saying, we don't like these layoffs, we don't like the closing of the DEI office, saw the common cause that they had with the pro-Palestinian protests and pivoted quickly to join forces on these issues.
Yeah. All the universities will be up on Capitol Hill. We're taping on Monday. They'll be up tomorrow to explain to the Senate Higher Education Subcommittee what exactly they have done to rid DEI from the campuses. It's going to be a long war. Someone made this analogy to me that when we finally desegregated the schools, it took over a decade to do it because segregation was so marinated in the entire education system that a lot had to be separated out. And I think that's what we're going to find out with DEI now. So what do you think is going to happen next?
Gosh, I really think it depends on what state you're in. You go back to even the 1960s when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and you started to see the anti-Vietnam War protests become larger and more aggressive and start with these sit-ins and taking over buildings. And Reagan just put his foot down and said, no, you're not going to do that, which harkened back to, of course, some labor unrest when Calvin Coolidge, I think, was governor of Massachusetts, and he cracked down on some of the labor unrest as governor, which catapulted him into the president, into the White House. And so I think you're going to see a pretty divergent approach across the country, depending kind of blue state versus red state. And unfortunately, we now have another couple generations of leadership that have managed to lurch even further to the left. So I'm going to guess that in a lot of blue states, very little will be done about these protests, up to and including significant property damage and probably even injuries and even loss of life.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we've seen the end of this. The places that have shown resolute leadership are going to, be less of an appealing target. I do predict that this summer is going to be, we're going to see some things that we haven't seen since the 60s. And I think there's a very self-conscious attempt on the part of this movement to emulate 1968. And it's no coincidence that we're going to have a Democratic convention coming up with a fairly weak leading nominee. So we'll see what happens. There may be a push to try to get someone else in that
and
spot.
in Chicago, no less.
And in Chicago, no less, exactly. So it should be a very interesting summer, and just stay tuned. We'll probably be revisiting it in the fall.
It is interesting. You talked about being around in '92. I want to having seen the marches, the marches against Vietnam. When I was coming up, there was a difference. When we got rid of the draft, the marches ended, even though the war continued.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and interestingly enough, the unrests on the campus escalated when the deferments for higher education were ended. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, when there was more skin in the game, now all of a sudden you saw the college students go, wait a minute, you mean I might have to go?
And yeah, here there's not that much skin in the game. No. So it's an interesting cultural thing that has happened to us. I mean, we saw yesterday Jerry Seinfeld, who is a comic icon, be booed at Duke University. So we'll have to see kind of what happens. I just want to close and make sure that I point out not only that Kevin Eltife and the Board of Regents at the UT has the support of the University of Texas. The American Council on Trustees and Alumni, ACTA, did a poll last week which found that 69% of Texans support bringing police onto the campus. That's pretty strong, and that includes Democrats, independents, and of course, Republicans. And over 70% in every demographic group did not want the president fired. So there's been a lot of talk. Erin and I have been in conversation. Well, what should we do about this vote of no confidence? Should we do we need to pass some kind of a recommendation that it doesn't matter? I think they just passed a recommendation that it doesn't matter.
That's right. He should frame it, put it on his wall.
Moving forward.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully, if we talk about this in another 6 months, it'll be over. You think this is going to impact the election? You kind of said that. But
well, I mean, it has the effect or the potential effect of having some key Democrat constituencies stay home. In a place like Michigan, it will probably put Michigan back in play. And it can only be unhelpful for the Democrats as this continues, which is why the Biden administration desperately wants some sort of an agreement to end the fighting and leave Hamas intact. Any agreement to end the fighting now, any ceasefire, allows a terror group to reconstitute, rebuild, and launch another October 7th.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine how they can't see it. How does it look to you?
Yeah, I think that it is going to be very localized, the impact here, but I think the overall impression that Texans and other folks are getting is that the normals need to reassert themselves. And I think they are. And I think we're seeing that the parents who are looking at sending their kids to college this year, next year, they don't want to send their kids into chaos. They want them to go there to learn. And public trust in higher education is plummeting. So this is not helping those institutions, the ones that caved. So I think overall, folks are tired of seeing the disorder and kind of want to return to something that looks more like a normal college education.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this is not the new normal. Thank you all for joining me today, and thank all of you out there for watching the Sherry Sylvester Show. You can subscribe to the Sherry Sylvester Show at Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Sylvester1630, and if you'd like to receive my 9th in Congress newsletter, which includes the weekly's winners and losers, you can sign up at TPPF's website, www.texaspolicy.com, 9th in Congress.